Settle in, dear listener, and let your breathing slow as we journey back through the mists of time, over 1,000 years ago, to the year 886 after the birth of Christ. Close your eyes and imagine the gentle lapping of the Seine River against wooden hulls, the soft creak of rope against timber, and the distant call of ravens in the morning mist. Our tale unfolds not with the clash of sword against shield, but with the quiet scratch of a wooden spoon against an iron pot, the whisper of wool against wool, and the gentle crackling of a hearth fire that never dies. This is the story of Eirik, known to his people as Peace-Maker, though he carried no sword and led no raids. His battles were fought against hunger, cold, and discord, enemies just as formidable as any warrior faced. In the Viking settlement outside the great walls of Paris, where Northmen had made their winter camp along the Seine's banks, Eirik served as huskarl, not the warrior housecarl you might know from the sagas, but something far more essential to survival, the keeper of the household, the maintainer of peace, what you might think of as a butler, though the Vikings had no such word. The settlement slept beneath a blanket of river mist as Eirik's internal rhythm, honed by 20 winters of service, pulled him from his sleeping bench. No cock had crowed, the Franks' roosters were silent behind Paris's walls, but Eirik's bones knew the hour as surely as they knew the coming weather. His movement was practiced and quiet, a lifetime of early mornings encoded in his muscles. The packed earth floor was cold beneath his bare feet, each step careful to avoid the sleeping forms of the younger servants who shared his corner of the longhouse. The air hung thick with the mingled scents of smoke, wool, and humanity, dozens of souls breathing in the darkness, their exhalations forming tiny clouds in the cold morning air. Eirik's hands found his worn woolen tunic by touch alone, the fabric soft from years of wear, patched and repatched with different wools until it had become a map of seasons survived. He pulled it over his linen undertunic, the layers essential for warmth in these months when the Frankish winter still held the land in its grip. His leather shoes, stuffed with dry grass for warmth, waited exactly where he had placed them the night before. The central hearth still glowed with embers, carefully banked the previous evening. This was the heart of survival, the fire that must never die. In the deep winter they had passed through, a dead hearth meant death itself might follow. Eirik knelt beside it, his knees protesting with the small pops and creaks that reminded him of his 43 winters. With practiced movements, he selected small, dry twigs from the pile he had prepared the night before. Each piece had been chosen for its dryness, its size, its burning qualities. The art of fire-keeping was not dramatic, it was patience, preparation, and understanding. He laid the twigs in a careful pattern over the glowing embers, then blew gently, steadily, his breath visible in the cold air as it coaxed the embers to remembrance. The first tiny flame flickered to life, catching the resin in a piece of pine kindling. The light danced across Eirik's weathered face, illuminating the deep lines around his eyes, lines earned not from laughter alone, but from years of squinting through smoke, checking stores in dim light, and watching always for the small signs of trouble that could grow into catastrophe if left unattended. As the fire grew, Eirik added larger pieces of wood, each placement deliberate. Too much too fast would smother the flame. Too little would let it die. This balance, this careful nurturing of essential things, was the core of his duty. The iron pot, blackened from countless meals, hung from its chain over the fire. Eirik swung it aside and checked its contents. Last night's stew had been parceled out carefully, but he had saved the bones and the thick bottom portion that clung to the pot's sides. These would form the base of this morning's porridge. Nothing could be wasted. Waste was a luxury the settlement could not afford. He made his way to the water barrel, breaking the thin skin of ice that had formed overnight. The water was bracingly cold as he poured it into a smaller wooden bucket. This too required judgment. Too much water taken now meant not enough for later, but too little meant the porridge would burn and stick. The storage area was Eirik's domain, and he navigated it in the darkness with the surety of a blind man in his own home. His fingers found the wooden box containing the barley, running through the grains to check for dampness or mold. Satisfied, he measured out portions with a carved wooden cup worn smooth by use. 17 warriors, 12 free women, 8 children, 6 thralls, and various guests who came and went. Each mouth needed feeding, each belly needed filling enough to work, but not so much that stores would fail before spring truly came. Back at the fire, he poured the barley into the water, now beginning to steam. The wooden spoon, carved by his own hand 3 summers ago from a piece of oak, moved in slow, steady circles. This was the meditation of morning, the rhythmic stirring that prevented sticking, that ensured even cooking, that transformed hard grain into sustaining porridge. As he stirred, Eirik's mind ranged over the day's needs. The salt fish hung in the storage house would need checking. The damp river air could bring mold if vigilance failed. The last of the autumn's dried berries should be added to the porridge for the children. They needed the strength such food could bring, and the sweetness would help the bitter herbs go down that kept the winter sickness at bay. Young Astrid stirred on her sleeping bench, the thrall girl who had shown promise in household management. Eirik had been teaching her the arts of survival, not just cooking and cleaning, but the deeper knowledge. How to read the signs of spoilage before it spread. How to stretch stores without seeming to. How to keep peace between strong-willed people forced to live in close quarters through the long winter months. She rose quietly, had learned that lesson well, and joined him at the fire without words. Speech would come later, when the household woke. Now was the time for quiet preparation, for the work that made all other work possible. Together, they prepared the morning meal in companionable silence. Astrid fetched the dried berries, counting them out carefully. Eirik showed her with gestures how to feel the consistency of the porridge, how it should coat the spoon but still pour. These were lessons that couldn't truly be taught with words. They had to be learned through the hands, through repetition, through the accumulated wisdom of countless mornings. The longhouse began to stir as the smell of cooking porridge filled the air. Warriors stretched on their benches, women tended to children, thralls began their duties. But for now, in this quiet hour before the day truly began, Eirik stood watch over the hearth, the keeper of the flame, the guardian against hunger, the peacemaker whose battles were fought with wooden spoons and careful planning. As the settlement woke around him, Eirik's mind drifted to how he had come to this position, this life of service that many warriors would scorn but which kept them all alive. He had not been born to this work, few were. His path had been carved by necessity and shaped by loss. 23 winters ago, he had been Eirik's sword arm, young and proud, sailing from Norway's fjords with dreams of gold and glory. His sword had tasted blood in Ireland, his shield had stood in the wall during raids along the Frankish coast. But it was not defeat in battle that changed his path, it was victory's price. During a raid on a monastery, he remembered it still, could smell the incense that clung to everything. His sword arm had been crushed beneath a falling stone cross. The monks had toppled it as the Vikings breached their walls, and Eirik had been trapped beneath its weight for hours while the battle raged around him. When his companions finally freed him, his sword days were over. The arm had healed, after a fashion, but it would never again have the strength or steadiness needed for the shield wall. A warrior who couldn't fight was usually a dead man, but Eirik had been fortunate. Or perhaps the gods had other plans. Old Gunnar, the Jarl's household manager, had seen something in the young broken warrior. Maybe it was the way Eirik had organized the younger warriors during his recovery, ensuring everyone had food and checking wounds for corruption. Maybe it was simply that Gunnar needed help and Eirik needed purpose. A man can serve with more than his sword, Gunnar had said, his voice gruff but not unkind. The sharpest blade is useless if the warrior wielding it starves or freezes. Someone must wage war against hunger, against cold, against disease. These enemies never retreat, never surrender, and never tire. Fighting them requires different weapons. The old man had been right. In the years that followed, Eirik learned that managing a household, especially one that moved with Viking expeditions, required strategy as complex as any battle plan. Knowing how much food 50 people needed for a month's journey. Understanding which herbs could fight infection and which would poison. Learning to read the weather signs that meant the difference between successful preservation of meat and deadly spoilage. Now, as he added precious salt to the morning porridge, salt worth its weight in silver, traded from merchants who brought it from the distant southern seas, Eirik understood that his work was its own kind of warfare. Every meal served was a small victory against starvation. Every successful storage of supplies was a fortress built against future need. The children were awake now, their voices adding to the growing symphony of morning sounds. Little Sigrid, the blacksmith's daughter, ran to him with the boundless energy that only the young possessed after sleeping on hard benches in the cold. "Eirik Peace-Maker," she said, using the name the children had given him after he had stopped a fight between two warriors over the last piece of honeyed bread by somehow producing 2 more pieces from his stores. "Will there be honey today?" He smiled, the expression creasing his weathered face into well-worn patterns. "Not honey, little one. But I have saved some dried apple pieces that might find their way into your bowl if you help Astrid with the water carrying." The child scampered off, eager to earn her treat. This too was part of his work, teaching the next generation that survival came through cooperation, through work, through thinking beyond the next meal to the meals that must come after. Jarl Ragnar emerged from his partitioned sleeping area at the far end of the longhouse. Even in the relative safety of the winter settlement, he wore his sword, though Eirik knew it was more from habit than necessity. The Franks behind their walls weren't likely to attack, and the other Viking groups along the river had learned to respect Ragnar's strength. "Peacemaker," the Jarl called out, using Eirik's earned name with genuine respect. "What news of our stores?" This was the morning ritual, as important as any religious observance. Eirik approached, automatically checking that his clothes were properly arranged, that he showed the proper respect due to his lord while maintaining the dignity of his position. "My lord," Eirik began, his voice carrying the careful modulation that could be heard without shouting, "we have grain sufficient for 3 weeks at current consumption. The salt fish will last longer if this dry weather holds. The meat is down to 2 barrels, but I've begun brewing more from the honey we traded for last week. The bigger concern is firewood. We're burning through it faster than expected with these cold mornings." Ragnar nodded thoughtfully. And the sick? 3 warriors still recover from the river fever, but the willow bark tea has broken their fevers. Thorstein's wound shows no sign of corruption thanks to the honey and herb poultice. The children are all well, praise the gods. Good. We have traders coming from the south today. They claim to have pepper and other spices. What can we spare for trade? This was where Eirik's true value showed. A less experienced household manager might simply report what they had. Eirik understood the deeper dance of survival and diplomacy. We have 2 extra wolf pelts from last month's hunt that we can spare. Also, Bjorn's wife has woven 3 lengths of excellent wool cloth that exceed our needs. But my lord, if I might suggest, pepper is valuable, but we need iron more. Our cooking pots are wearing thin, and without them, all the spice in the world won't help us. Ragnar smiled slightly. This is why you're worth 3 warriors, Peacemaker. Make it so. And ensure our guests are fed well enough to speak favorably of us when they return south, but not so well that they think us wasteful. As the Jarl moved away to attend to other matters, Eirik returned to his morning duties. The porridge was ready now, perfectly cooked, neither too thick nor too thin. He added the dried berries and apple pieces, distributing them carefully so that each bowl would have some sweetness. The sun had climbed halfway to its modest winter zenith when Eirik made his way to the storage house. This separate building, constructed with overlapping logs chinked with mud and moss, was his fortress against famine. The door, reinforced with iron bands traded at great cost, squeaked on its leather hinges as he entered. Inside, the air was cool and dry, tinged with the mingled scents of smoke, salt, and herbs. Bundles of dried plants hung from the rafters, thyme, sage, yarrow, and dozen others, each with their purpose. Some for flavor, some for medicine, some for preservation. The knowledge of which was which, and how to use them, was hard-won through generations of trial and error. The salt fish hung in neat rows, each piece carefully inspected before storage. Salt was precious, more valuable than gold in some ways, for gold couldn't preserve food through a long winter. Eirik examined each fish with practiced eyes and fingers, looking for any sign of moisture or spoilage. One fish showing corruption could spread to all if not caught quickly. Finding a piece that was developing a suspicious softness, he removed it immediately. It wasn't spoiled yet, but it would be soon. This would go into today's stew, cooked thoroughly to ensure safety. Nothing wasted, everything used at its proper time. The barrels along the walls held different treasures. Grain, of course, barley, rye, and a small precious amount of wheat traded from Frankish farmers brave enough to deal with Vikings. Each barrel was sealed with wax to keep moisture and pests out. Eirik knocked on each with his knuckles, listening to the sound. A full barrel had a different tone than one that had been breached by mice or insects. In the corner, covered with leather and weighted with stones, was the fermentation crock. Here, cabbage transformed slowly into sauerkraut, the fermentation process not only preserving the vegetable but creating something that would keep the bleeding sickness away during the long months without fresh food. The smell when he lifted the cover was sharp, acidic, but clean, the smell of successful preservation. Young Astrid joined him, as he had asked her to that morning. Teaching was as important as doing, for what would happen when his bones finally failed him? Who would carry on this crucial knowledge? "Tell me," he said, gesturing at the storage around them, "what do you see?" She looked confused. Food, Eirik. Supplies. Look deeper, he instructed gently. What do you really see? She studied the room more carefully, and he could see her mind working, trying to understand what lesson he was imparting. Time, she ventured after a moment. Each thing here is time, time until we starve, time until spring comes. Good, Eirik nodded approvingly. But more than that. This room is a map of the year. The salt fish, caught in summer when the runs were strong, preserved when salt could be traded for. The grain, harvested in autumn, either by our own hands from fields we protected or traded for with goods from raids. The sauerkraut, made when cabbages were fresh. Each thing here tells a story of a problem solved, a future need anticipated. He moved to a particular barrel, smaller than the others and marked with a carved rune. This one contains our medical supplies. Honey for wounds, willow bark for fever, poppy seeds for severe pain, dried mushrooms that bring visions for the seer. If I fall tomorrow, you must know not just what is here, but why, and how to use it. They spent the next hour going through the supplies systematically. Eirik taught her the signs of weevils in grain, the smell of rancid fat, the look of mold beginning beneath the surface of cheese. He showed her how to cut away the spoiled parts while saving what remained good, how to judge when something could be saved and when it must be discarded entirely. Waste is sin, he told her, but poison is worse. Better to lose a little food than to lose a life to spoiled meat or corrupted grain. The judgment of what can be saved, that comes only with experience. A commotion outside drew their attention. The traders had arrived earlier than expected. Eirik quickly instructed Astrid on which supplies to prepare for display, not their best, which they needed, nor their worst, which would insult, but the middle ground that showed prosperity without excess. The Frankish traders approached cautiously, as well they might. The Viking settlement was peaceful for now, engaged in trade rather than raiding, but memories were long on both sides. Eirik watched from the doorway of the storage house as they set up their goods in the designated trading area, a cleared space between the longhouses where such business was conducted. There were 3 of them, an older man, clearly the leader, with gray threading through his brown beard, and 2 younger men who were probably his sons or nephews. They had a cart pulled by a tired-looking ox, loaded with goods covered by oiled cloth. Guards would have been wise, but guards cost money, and these traders were betting on the Vikings' honor during established trading times. Eirik approached them before the warriors could, carrying a wooden bowl of fresh water and a small loaf of bread, guest gifts that established peaceful intent. The older trader's eyes widened slightly in surprise. He had expected warriors, perhaps threats or boasts. Instead, he was greeted by a simply dressed man offering hospitality. I am Eirik, household manager to Jarl Ragnar, he said in carefully pronounced Frankish. He had learned the language over years of trading, understanding that communication prevented misunderstanding, and misunderstanding led to violence. You are welcome in our settlement as traders. The older man relaxed visibly. I am Guillaume, he replied, accepting the bread and water with appropriate ceremony. We come from Tours, with goods for trade. As Guillaume's sons began unpacking their wares, Eirik studied what they had brought. Pepper, as promised, he could smell it even through its leather wrapping. Salt, always welcome. Iron tools and raw iron for the blacksmith. clay pots, well made and properly fired. And something unexpected, small glass vials that caught the weak winter sunlight. Medicine? Eirik asked, gesturing to the vials. Guillaume nodded. From the monastery at Tours. The monks make it from Roman recipes. It helps with the lung sickness that comes with winter. This was interesting. The Vikings had their own medicine, of course, but new knowledge was always valuable. Eirik examined one vial carefully, unstopping it to smell the contents. Honey, certainly, but also herbs he didn't recognize, and something with a sharp, almost metallic scent. "What will you take for these?" he asked. Guillaume named his price, far too high, of course. This was expected. The dance of trading was as ritualized as any religious ceremony. Eirik countered with an offer of his own, absurdly low. Guillaume looked offended, though his eyes showed he wasn't really. Back and forth they went, each adjustment bringing them closer to the true price both knew they would eventually reach. As they negotiated, Eirik was aware of the settlement watching. Some warriors had gathered, curious about the foreign traders. Children peered around their mothers' skirts. This too was part of his role, showing that Vikings could be more than raiders, that trade and negotiation could bring prosperity just as surely as the sword. Finally, they reached an agreement. For the medicine, 2 wolf pelts and a length of the finest woven cloth. For iron sufficient to repair their tools and make new ones, they would trade salt fish and preserved meat. The pepper remained a problem. Guillaume wanted silver, which they had little of. Perhaps, Eirik suggested carefully, you would consider a different trade. Your ox looks tired, and winter travel is hard on beasts. We have a young ox, strong and well-fed, that might serve you better for your return journey. In exchange, your ox, which we can rest and restore, plus the pepper and some salt. Guillaume considered this. A young, strong ox was worth considerable value, but his own beast was indeed struggling. The trade would get him home safer and faster, and the Vikings were known for their animal husbandry. "I would need to see this ox," he said finally. Eirik led him to the small stable where their few cattle were kept. The ox in question was indeed young and strong, its coat glossy with good health despite the winter. Guillaume examined it with an expert eye, checking its teeth, its hooves, its temperament. "This is a good beast," he admitted. "But it's worth more than pepper and salt." "Then add the knowledge," Eirik suggested. "Tell me how the monks make their medicine. Not their secret ingredients, I don't ask for that, but the method. How do they preserve the honey's healing properties while adding the herbs? How do they keep it from spoiling?" Guillaume looked surprised again. Most Vikings he had dealt with wanted only goods, not knowledge. But this one, this peacemaker as he heard others call him, understood that knowledge was the most valuable trait of all. "You're different from the others," Guillaume observed. "We're all trying to survive," Eirik replied simply. "Your monks with their prayers and medicines, us with our swords and ships. But in the end, we all need food, warmth, and healing. These things are universal." Guillaume nodded slowly, then began to explain the process. How the honey must be heated but not boiled, how the herbs must be added at exactly the right temperature, how the mixture must be sealed while still warm to prevent corruption. Eirik listened intently, occasionally asking clarifying questions, filing the information away in his memory. As the sun reached its zenith, the trading was completed. Guillaume and his sons shared a meal with the Vikings, simple food but well prepared, exactly the right gesture of hospitality. The two groups, historical enemies, sat together peacefully, sharing bread and salt fish, while children of both cultures played nearby. That afternoon, while the traders rested before their return journey, Eirik worked with the settlement's healer, an elderly woman named Gudrun who had forgotten more about herbs than most would ever know. Together, they attempted to recreate the monk's medicine using Viking ingredients and the method Guillaume had described. Gudrun's workspace was a small section of the longhouse, curtained off and kept scrupulously clean. Bundles of herbs hung from every available surface, and the air was thick with their mingled scents, some pleasant, some medicinal, some that made the nose wrinkle. "The Franks know some things," Gudrun admitted grudgingly, which from her was high praise indeed. She had been healing Vikings for 40 years and was skeptical of foreign methods. "This heating but not boiling, it makes sense. Too much heat destroys the healing properties." They worked together in comfortable partnership, two practitioners of the survival arts sharing knowledge. Eirik heated honey in a small iron pot, watching carefully for the first sign of bubbles that would indicate too much heat. Gudrun prepared the herbs, not the same as the monks used, but Viking equivalents that should have similar properties. "Long word for the breathing," she muttered, crushing dried leaves with a stone pestle. "Time for the cough. Horehound to clear the chest. And..." She paused, considering, "a small amount of pine resin, melted and strained. It helps preserve and adds its own healing." As Eirik stirred the warming honey, he reflected on how much of survival depended on accumulated knowledge. Each generation learning from the last, adding their own discoveries, passing it forward. The monks in their monasteries, the Vikings in their longhouses, all building on the wisdom of their ancestors. "Tell me," he asked Gudrun as they worked, "how did you learn your craft?" The old woman smiled, her face creasing into a map of wrinkles. "My mother, and her mother before her. Back and back, woman to woman, each adding what she learned. My grandmother remembered the great sickness that came when she was young. Half the settlement died before they discovered that willow bark tea could break the fever. My mother learned from a captured Irish monk that honey on wounds prevented the corruption. I learned from a Slavic trader that certain mushrooms could stop bleeding." She added the crushed herbs to the warm honey, stirring carefully with a wooden spoon reserved for medicine making. "And now I learned from Frankish monks through a Viking Peace-Maker that controlling the heat preserves the strength. Knowledge has no borders, Eirik. It flows like water, finding its way wherever people are willing to learn." They worked through the afternoon, making several batches with slight variations, carefully marking each with carved runes so they would know which was which. This too was important, keeping records, maintaining knowledge, ensuring that successes could be repeated and failures avoided. As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, a young warrior named Bjorn burst into the longhouse. His face was flushed with exertion and concern. "Peacemaker," he gasped, "riders approaching from the north. Vikings, but not ours." This was potentially serious. While Viking groups generally respected each other's territories during winter settlements, desperate times could make even honor flexible. Eirik quickly assessed the situation. Most of their warriors were away on a hunting expedition, not expected back until tomorrow. They had perhaps 10 fighting men in the settlement, plus the women who could fight if necessary. How many? Eirik asked calmly, though his mind was already racing through possibilities. 20, maybe 25. They carry weapons but no shields raised. Their leader bears a white branch. A parley sign, then. They came to talk, not fight. Still, 25 armed Vikings were a threat that couldn't be ignored. Send word to Jarl Ragnar, Eirik instructed. Have all warriors arm themselves but keep weapons sheathed. Prepare food and drink for guests. If they come in peace, we'll receive them as such. If not... He paused. If not, at least we'll know their intentions quickly. As the strange Vikings approached, Eirik supervised rapid preparations. In Viking culture, hospitality was sacred, but it was also strategic. How you received guests, even unexpected, potentially dangerous ones, said much about your strength and resources. Astrid, he called to his apprentice, bring out the good mead, but not the best. Set up the outdoor fire, we'll receive them outside initially, easier to defend if needed. Have the women prepare bread and soup, enough to show abundance but not so much as to seem wasteful. The settlement moved with practiced efficiency. This wasn't their first unexpected visit, though usually traders gave more warning. Warriors took positions that looked casual but provided good defensive coverage. Women and children were moved to the most defensible longhouse, though they went calmly, without obvious fear. Eirik himself stood beside Jarl Ragnar as the visitors arrived. The stranger's leader was a large man with iron-gray hair and a beard braided with silver rings. His clothes were well-made but showed the wear of hard travel. His eyes, blue as winter ice, took in everything: the defensive positions, the state of the buildings, the health of the people. "I am Hakon Icewalker," he announced, his voice carrying the accent of the far north, perhaps even Iceland. "We seek shelter and provisions. The winter has been harder than expected, and game has been scarce." Ragnar stepped forward, his hand resting casually on his sword hilt, not a threat, but a reminder. "I am Ragnar Stormbringer, Jarl of this settlement. You're far from the usual routes, Hakon Icewalker." "Aye," Hakon agreed readily. "We were traveling to join the great army forming in East Anglia, but winter caught us. We've been surviving as we could, but..." He paused, and Eirik could see the calculation in his eyes, the decision of how much weakness to admit. "We have sick among us. The lung fever. We've lost 3 men already. This changed things." Sick Vikings were less of a threat but potentially more dangerous in a different way. Disease could destroy a settlement as surely as any battle. Gudrun pushed forward, ignoring protocol with the privilege of age and wisdom. "How long have they been sick? Do they cough blood?" Hakon looked surprised at being addressed by an old woman, but he answered respectfully. 2 weeks for the worst of them. No blood yet, but the fever won't break." Gudrun looked at Eirik meaningfully. The medicine they had just been preparing could be exactly what was needed. This could be a test of its effectiveness, but also an opportunity. Eirik stepped forward, bowing slightly to both Jarls. "My lords, if I may suggest, we have recently acquired and prepared medicine that may help with the lung fever. If Hakon Icewalker's people are willing, we could trade medical aid for future considerations." Hakon's eyes sharpened. What kind of considerations? Information, Eirik replied promptly. News from the north, the state of the passages, the movement of armies. Also, a promise of aid if we should need it in the future. Alliances forged in times of need are often the strongest. Ragnar nodded approvingly. This was why he valued Eirik, the ability to see opportunity where others saw only problem. And if your medicine doesn't work? Hakon asked bluntly. Then we've shared what we had in good faith, Eirik answered. The gods judge us by our intentions as much as our results. But Gudrun Herbwise has healed more men than either of us has killed in battle. I trust her skill. Hakon considered this, then made his decision. We accept your hospitality and your aid, Ragnar Stormbringer. May the gods witness our gratitude. The formal words spoken, the tension eased noticeably. Eirik immediately set about organizing the integration of 25 additional people into their settlement routine. It would strain their resources, but not break them if managed carefully. The sick were brought to Gudrun's healing space, 5 men in various stages of the long fever. She and Eirik worked through the evening, administering the new medicine along with traditional treatments. Willow bark tea for fever, steam treatments with pine needles for congestion, the honey herb mixture for the cough and infection. As night fell and the 2 groups of Vikings shared the evening meal around the great outdoor fire, Eirik moved among them, ensuring everyone was fed, monitoring the subtle dynamics between the groups. This was delicate work, 2 proud groups forced together by circumstance, each wary of showing weakness, each protective of their honor. He noticed one of Hakon's men, a young warrior barely past his first beard, sitting apart from the others, shivering despite the fire's warmth. The first signs of the fever, perhaps. Eirik brought him a bowl of hot soup and a fur blanket, sitting beside him quietly. You're not a warrior, the young man observed, not unkindly but with curiosity. Not anymore, Eirik replied, showing his damaged arm. Now I fight different battles. Against what? Against hunger, cold, disease, discord. Against all the things that kill warriors more surely than any blade. Eirik studied the young man's flushed face. You're starting the fever. The warrior's jaw tightened. I'm fine. Pride is a luxury the sick can't afford, Eirik said gently. Come, let Gudrun examine you. Catching it early makes all the difference. Reluctantly, the young warrior followed him to the healing space. This too was part of Eirik's work, the gentle persuasion that kept proud men alive despite themselves. The settlement had finally quieted, the 2 groups of Vikings having found an uneasy but functional peace. Eirik couldn't sleep, he rarely could when there were sick to tend and strangers to watch. He made his quiet rounds, checking the fires, ensuring the sentries were alert, monitoring supplies that would need to stretch further now. In the healing space, Gudrun dozed in her chair, but she woke instantly when he entered. Old habits of healers and household managers, always ready, never fully asleep when need might call. How are they? He asked softly. 2 will likely recover, the medicine is helping, I can see it. 2 are uncertain. 1. She shook her head. He waited too long. Pride, always pride with warriors. If they came when first sick instead of when nearly dead, I could save more of them. Eirik nodded, understanding. He checked the medicine supply, They had enough for perhaps 3 more days of treatment at current usage. After that, they would need to make more, but their honey stores were running low. "I'll speak with the traders before they leave tomorrow," he said. "They might have more honey to trade." "Or," Gudrun suggested with a slight smile, "you could ask our new guests. Northern Vikings often carry honey for wound treatment. They might trade some for the medicine that's healing their men." This was why Gudrun had survived so long. She understood not just herbs but people. Eirik made a mental note to approach Hakon in the morning. He continued his rounds, stopping at the main longhouse where both groups had bedded down for the night. The sound of sleeping men filled the space, snores, mutters, the occasional cry from someone caught in dreams of battle or loss. Near the door, one of Hakon's men sat awake, keeping watch. They exchanged nods, professional recognition between men who understood that vigilance was the price of survival. Outside, the winter night was clear and bitter cold. Stars spread across the sky like scattered ice crystals, and his breath formed clouds that dissipated quickly in the still air. The Seine moved sluggishly in the cold, and he could hear the occasional crack of ice along its edges. At the storage house, he did a final check of supplies. With 45 extra mouths to feed, even for a few days, their margins had become thinner. He calculated rapidly. If he reduced portions slightly, added more water to the porridge, used some of the emergency dried meat reserves, they could manage for a week. Longer if the hunting party returned with good results. A sound made him turn. Astrid had followed him, wrapped in a thick woolen cloak. "You should be sleeping," he said, though not harshly. "So should you," she replied with the boldness of youth. "I wanted to see how you handle this. The unexpected guests, the stretched supplies, the danger of disease." He gestured for her to sit on a bench near the storage house door. "You handle it by not panicking. By thinking 3 steps ahead. By remembering that today's enemy might be tomorrow's ally, and today's ally might be tomorrow's enemy. But most importantly, you handle it by doing what needs to be done, when it needs to be done, without complaint or hesitation." "Aren't you worried?" she asked. "About having enough food, about the sickness spreading, about these strangers?" "Worry is like a small fire," Eirik replied, pulling his own cloak tighter against the cold. "Controlled, it keeps you warm and alert. Uncontrolled, it burns everything down. Yes, I worry. But I use that worry to drive preparation, not paralysis." They sat in companionable silence for a moment, watching their breath mist in the cold air. Then Astrid asked, "Why do they call you Peacemaker?" "It's not a very Viking name." Eirik smiled slightly. "No, it's not. I earned it 5 winters ago. 2 jarls were about to fight over winter quarters. Both groups needed the same sheltered valley to survive. The fight would have left both groups weakened, easy prey for Frankish soldiers or other Vikings. I suggested a different solution." "What?" "I organized a feast. Both groups together. While they ate, I had the skalds from each group tell stories. Then I suggested a competition, not of weapons but of skills. Woodcraft, hunting, cooking, weaving. Each group would judge the other fairly. Winners would get first choice of settlement location, but both groups would help each other build shelters. And it worked. It almost didn't. but hunger and cold are powerful motivators for cooperation. By the time the competitions were done, the groups had mingled enough to see each other as people rather than enemies. They ended up settling adjacent to each other, close enough for mutual defense but separate enough for pride. Both groups survived the winter. Neither would have if they'd fought. So you made peace. I made survival possible. Peace was just the tool required. He stood, joints protesting the cold. Come, we should try to sleep. Tomorrow will bring its own challenges. Dawn came gray and reluctant, clouds having moved in during the night to trap the earth in a dim twilight. Eirik woke to the sound of coughing, harsh, wet coughing that spoke of lungs fighting infection. More of Hakon's men had developed the fever during the night. He rose quickly but quietly, his morning routine now complicated by the additional people and the growing medical crisis. In the healing space, Gudrun was already at work, her face drawn with exhaustion but her hands steady as she administered medicine. "We need more," she said simply when she saw him. "At this rate, we'll be out by nightfall." Eirik found Hakon already awake, standing outside the longhouse despite the cold, his face troubled. The pride of asking for help was warring with the need to save his men. "Your medicine is working," Hakon said without preamble. "2 of my men are already improving. But more are falling sick." "We need honey to make more medicine," Eirik said directly. Warriors respected directness. "Do you have any to trade?" Hakon's jaw tightened. "We have perhaps 2 jars. It's all we have for wounds." "We can make more medicine than 2 jars worth," Eirik offered. "Enough for your men and to leave you with some for your journey. In exchange, we need information about the northern passages and a sworn alliance for mutual aid." "You bargain hard for a peacemaker." "Survival requires hard bargains sometimes. But consider, your men live or die based on this decision. Pride is a cold comfort to the dead." Hakon was silent for a long moment, watching the mist rise from the river. Then he spoke, his voice carrying the weight of decision. "You'll have your honey and your information. The alliance." He paused. "That must be sworn between Jarls, not underlings." "Agreed. I'll speak with Jarl Ragnar." The morning progressed with intense activity. Eirik and Gudrun worked to produce more medicine, carefully following the process they had learned, adjusting based on what they had observed about its effectiveness. The honey from Hakon's stores was darker than what they had used before, gathered from northern forests rather than meadow flowers. It might make the medicine stronger, or different, only time would tell. As they worked, Hakon fulfilled his part of the bargain, sharing information about the north. The passages through the Norwegian mountains were still blocked with snow. The Danish armies were gathering for spring raids on England. Most importantly, he had heard rumors of a Frankish army moving north, possibly to attempt retaking Paris from the various Viking settlements along the Seine. This last piece of information was crucial. If true, it changed everything about their winter settlement. Eirik immediately informed Jarl Ragnar, who called a council of both his warriors and Hakon's leaders. The council met in the main longhouse, warriors seated on benches along both sides, the 2 Jarls at the head. Eirik stood to the side. He was not a warrior and had no official voice in such councils, but Ragnar often asked his opinion on matters of supply and sustainability. "If the Franks come," Ragnar was saying, "we have 3 choices. fight, flee, or negotiate. Fighting in winter with sick men is foolish, one of Ragnar's older warriors said. But fleeing looks weak. Negotiation with Franks? Hakon spat. They're oath breakers and Christian dogs. They're also practical, Eirik interjected quietly, then looked at Ragnar for permission to continue. The Jarl nodded. The Franks don't want to fight in winter either, Eirik explained. Their supply lines would be stretched, their soldiers cold and miserable. If they're coming, it's likely for show, to demonstrate they haven't abandoned Paris entirely. We could offer them a winter truce, perhaps even trade. They need furs and preserved foods as much as we need grain and iron. You would have us trade with our enemies, one of Hakon's men demanded. I would have us survive, Eirik replied calmly. Dead Vikings hold no land, raid no monasteries, and sing no songs. Living Vikings who trade through winter can raid again in spring if they choose. The debate continued, but Eirik had planted the seed of pragmatism. He returned to his work, knowing that warriors needed time to wrap their minds around solutions that didn't involve swords. By midday, they had produced enough medicine for all the sick, with extra for future need. The young warrior Eirik had identified the night before was responding well to early treatment, which had impressed Hakon's men. They were beginning to see the value of Eirik's different kind of warfare. 3 days had passed since Hakon's arrival. The medicine was proving effective, most of the sick were recovering, though one man had died despite all efforts. He was burned on a pyre by the river, both groups of Vikings standing together in respect for the fallen warrior. The settlement had found a new rhythm incorporating the visitors. Hakon's men helped with hunting and wood gathering, earning their keep while they recovered. The two groups had begun the careful process of forming bonds, shared meals, shared stories, shared work. Eirik found himself often in conversation with Hakon's skald, an elderly man named Thorkel who had traveled farther than most Vikings ever dreamed. They sat by the fire one evening, the old storyteller sharing tales of Iceland and lands even further west. They say there's land beyond Iceland, Thorkel said, his voice taking on the rhythmic cadence of the storyteller. Land where trees grow tall and game runs thick. Some call it Vinland for the grapes that grow wild there. Have you seen it? Eirik asked, genuinely curious. No, but I've spoken with men who claim they have. They say the natives there are fierce but willing to trade. They have furs unlike anything we know, and foods that keep men healthy through longest winters. Foods? This caught Eirik's attention. New foods meant new ways to survive, new methods of preservation. A yellow grain that grows on tall stalks, Thorkel described. Beans that can be dried and stored for years. Squashes that keep all winter in cold storage without corruption. Eirik filed this information away. If Vikings were truly settling new lands, they would need household managers who understood not just Norse ways but could adapt to new environments, new foods, new challenges. You think deeply for a servant, Thorkel observed, not unkindly. We're all servants to something, Eirik replied. Warriors serve glory and their jarls. Jarls serve their ambitions and their people. I serve survival itself. Without it, all other service is meaningless. The old skald nodded slowly. You would make an interesting subject for a saga, Peace-Maker. The warrior who conquered hunger instead of lands. Sagas are for heroes, Eirik said with a slight smile. "I'm just a man who counts barrels and stirs porridge." "The greatest heroes are often those who don't know they are one," Thorkel replied cryptically. Their conversation was interrupted by a commotion at the settlement's edge. The hunting party had returned, and successfully, by the sounds of celebration. Eirik rose immediately, moving to supervise the processing of whatever they had brought. It was a good haul: 2 deer, several rabbits, and surprisingly, a wild boar. The latter was especially valuable, not just for the meat but for the fat that could be rendered for cooking and preservation. Eirik organized the butchering with practiced efficiency. Every part would be used: meat for eating, organs for nutrition, bones for soup, and eventually for tools, hide for leather, sinew for thread. The boar's bristles would make brushes, its tusks decorative items for trade. He worked alongside the hunters, his damaged arm no impediment to the careful work of preservation. Salt for some meat, smoking for others, and the choicest pieces for immediate consumption to celebrate the successful hunt. "You work like a man who's known hunger," observed one of Hakon's warriors, a scarred veteran named Grimr, who had initially been skeptical of the Peacemaker. "Every wise man has known hunger," Eirik replied, carefully cutting meat into strips for drying. "It's the best teacher of appreciation and preparation." "Where did you learn all this?" "The preservation, the medicine, the trading?" "Everywhere," Eirik answered honestly. "From my mother, who kept our farm alive when my father went Viking. From an Irish monk who taught me letters and numbers in exchange for food. From a Slavic woman who showed me how to preserve cabbage. From every mistake that cost food, every success that saved it. Knowledge comes from many sources if you're willing to learn." As night fell, the settlement feasted on fresh meat, the 2 groups of Vikings now mingling freely. Stories were told, songs were sung, and for a moment, the harsh realities of winter survival were pushed aside by the simple joy of full bellies and warm fires. But Eirik, even while ensuring everyone was fed, was thinking ahead. The successful hunt would extend their supplies significantly, but winter was far from over. And if the rumors of a Frankish army were true, they might need those supplies for flight or siege rather than simple survival. A week had passed since Hakon's arrival, and the settlement had adapted to its expanded population. The sick had mostly recovered, bonds had formed between the groups, and Eirik had successfully stretched supplies to accommodate everyone. But now came the delicate matter of the future. Jarl Ragnar and Hakon had been in private discussion for hours. The alliance that both groups needed but neither wanted to seem desperate for was being negotiated. Eirik had been called in several times to advise on practical matters: how long supplies could last if the groups remained together, what resources would be needed for a potential fight or flight from Frankish forces. Finally, as the sun reached its zenith on a surprisingly clear winter day, both Jarls emerged. They would make their announcement at the evening meal, but Eirik could read success in Ragnar's slight smile and Hakon's more relaxed posture. In preparation for what would essentially be an alliance feast, Eirik orchestrated the creation of a meal worthy of the occasion. The last of the mead would be brought out, the best preserved meats prepared, and bread made from their precious wheat flour rather than the everyday barley. But first, there was other work. Eirik found himself teaching a group of younger Vikings from both bands the art of smoking meat. The smoking house, a small structure separate from the main buildings, was thick with aromatic smoke from apple and oak wood. Too much smoke and the meat turns bitter, he explained, adjusting the fire to produce the right amount of heat and smoke. Too little and it won't preserve properly. The color tells you when it's right, deep brown, not black, with a shine from the rendered fat. One of Hakon's young warriors, barely 16 winters, asked, "Why do you teach us this?" "This is thrall work." "Is eating thrall work?" Eirik asked mildly. "Is surviving winter?" "Every skill that keeps you alive is worth learning." "What happens if you're separated from your band, alone in hostile territory? Will your sword skill fill your belly? Will your prowess in battle keep meat from spoiling?" The young man looked thoughtful, then ashamed. "I apologize, Peacemaker. I spoke without thinking." "No apology needed. But think on this, the greatest warriors are those who can survive long enough to become old warriors. And old warriors are those who learned every survival skill they could." As the afternoon progressed, Eirik noticed increased activity at the settlement's perimeter. Scouts were being sent out more frequently. When he asked one of the returning scouts, he learned why: signs of movement to the south. Not an army, but perhaps advanced scouts of one. This intelligence added urgency to the evening's alliance feast. If the Franks were indeed coming, having two bands formally allied would be crucial for defense or negotiated withdrawal. The feast itself was a masterwork of resource management disguised as abundance. Eirik had arranged the food to look more plentiful than it was: bread sliced thick but fewer loaves than appeared, meat arranged artfully to cover the wooden platters completely, vegetables from their preserved stores prepared with herbs to make them seem fresh. As the two groups gathered, Ragnar stood first. "Brothers of the North," he began, his voice carrying to every corner of the longhouse. "We have shared food, shelter, and medicine. We have stood together in respect for our fallen. Now, Hakon Icewalker and I formalize what our actions have already declared: an alliance between our bands." Hakon stood as well. "From this day until the summer solstice, our bands are one. We share enemies and allies, resources and hardships. Any who attack one attack both. Any who trade with one trade with both." The formal words were followed by the exchanging of arm rings, the mingling of blood from small cuts on their palms, and the sharing of mead from the same horn. Ancient rituals that bound men more surely than any written contract. But Eirik noticed something else during the ceremony. Guillaume, the Frankish trader, had returned, slipping into the longhouse quietly during the proceedings. His face was grave, and he caught Eirik's eye meaningfully. After the formal ceremonies, while warriors celebrated their new alliance, Eirik made his way to Guillaume. "You bring news," Eirik said. It wasn't a question. "The Frankish army marches from Paris," Guillaume said quietly. "Not to attack, but to establish a winter camp between you and the city. They want to control trade and movement on the river." This was both better and worse than expected. No immediate attack, but a Frankish army between them and their main trading routes would strangle them slowly. "How many?" Eirik asked. 200, perhaps 250. Well supplied for winter camping. Eirik quickly calculated. The combined Viking force now numbered about 70 warriors, plus women and older children who could fight if necessary. Not enough for a direct confrontation, but perhaps enough to negotiate from a position of some strength. "Why tell us this?" Eirik asked. Guillaume had no love for Vikings, that was clear. Because war is bad for trade, the merchant replied pragmatically. And because you treated me fairly, showed that Vikings can be more than raiders. If there's to be peace, it must be negotiated by those who understand both sides. Eirik brought this information to Ragnar and Hakon immediately. The celebration dimmed as the Jarls absorbed the news, but it didn't die. Vikings were nothing if not pragmatic about danger. We could move north, Hakon suggested. Find winter quarters elsewhere. In deepest winter, with 6 still recovering? Ragnar shook his head. We'd lose half our people to cold. Then we negotiate, Eirik suggested. Guillaume could be our intermediary. The Franks want control of trade? We can offer that, for a price. Safe passage for merchants, guaranteed peace until spring, in exchange for trade rights and no interference with our settlement. You would have us bow to Franks? Hakon's voice was dangerous. I would have us survive winter and be strong for spring, Eirik replied steadily. Bowing and bending are different things. A tree that bends in the storm stands straight when it passes. A tree that refuses to bend breaks. The negotiations with the Franks had taken 3 days, conducted through Guillaume's careful mediation. The result was not victory, but it was survival. The Viking settlement would remain unmolested through winter in exchange for allowing Frankish control of river trade and a promise of no raiding until after the spring thaw. Some warriors grumbled about the agreement, but full bellies and warm fires did much to ease their discontent. The Frankish army had established their camp a day's march south, close enough to monitor but far enough to avoid daily friction. Now, in the deepest part of winter, with snow falling steadily for 2 days, the real test of survival began. Eirik moved through the settlement like a ghost, checking supplies, monitoring health, solving small problems before they became large ones. The merger of the 2 bands had created unexpected challenges. Different groups had different traditions around food, different preferences, different taboos. Hakon's people wouldn't eat horse meat, considering horses too noble. Some of Ragnar's band wouldn't eat certain fish, believing them cursed. Eirik navigated these preferences carefully, ensuring everyone was fed while respecting their beliefs. In the storage house, he conducted his daily inventory with Astrid. She had proven an apt pupil, her memory for numbers and quantities nearly matching his own. The barley will last another moon at current consumption, she reported. The preserved meat perhaps 3 weeks longer. But the salt? The salt is nearly gone, Eirik finished. I know. We'll need to trade with the Franks for more. Will they trade with us? Guillaume will arrange it. For a fee, of course, but we have wolf pelts and worked leather to trade. They worked in companionable silence for a while, checking each barrel, each bundle, each precious store of food. Then Astrid asked, what happens when spring comes? When the alliance ends? Eirik paused in his work. It was a good question, one that had been occupying his thoughts. Some of Hakon's band will likely stay, marriages have already been arranged. Others will move on to their original destination. As for us, he shrugged. That's for the Jarl to decide. But wherever we go, people will need feeding, organizing, managing. Our work never ends. A disturbance outside caught their attention, shouting, but not alarm. They emerged to find a hunting party had returned with unexpected success. They had found a deer that had broken through river ice and frozen, perfectly preserved by the cold. Fresh meat in deepest winter was a gift from the gods. But as Eirik supervised the butchering, he noticed something concerning. One of the hunters, a young man named Eirik Redbeard, had a deep gash on his arm, poorly bandaged and showing signs of infection. "When did this happen?" Eirik asked, examining the wound. 3 days ago," Eirik admitted. Didn't want to bother Gudrun with something so small. "Small wounds become big problems when ignored," Eirik said, leading him to the healing space. "Pride has killed more Vikings than all the Frankish swords combined." Gudrun clucked disapprovingly when she saw the wound. "Foolish boy. Another day and you might have lost the arm." She began cleaning it with heated water and strong meat, causing Eirik to hiss in pain. "Eirik, prepare the honey poultice. And add extra garlic, this needs its strength." As Eirik prepared the medicine, he reflected on how much they had all learned this winter. The combination of Frankish knowledge, Viking tradition, and practical experimentation had created new methods, new treatments. Knowledge truly did flow like water, finding its level regardless of boundaries. That evening, as snow continued to fall, the settlement gathered in the main longhouse for the night meal and stories. Thorkel the Skald had prepared a new tale, one that wove together the events of their winter, the arrival of strangers becoming allies, the healing of the sick, the negotiations with enemies. But he transformed it, as Skalds do, into something greater. In his telling, Eirik became a wise counselor whose words turned aside war, Gudrun a magical healer whose potions could call men back from death's door, the alliance a bond forged by the gods themselves. Eirik listened with amusement and some embarrassment. He was no hero, just a practical man doing necessary work. But he understood the importance of stories, how they bound communities together, gave meaning to hardship, transformed survival into saga. Winter's grip had finally begun to loosen. The days grew marginally longer, the sun climbing slightly higher in its arc across the sky. Ice on the Seine began to crack and shift, creating a constant background symphony of pops and groans. The promise of spring whispered through the settlement, bringing both hope and tension. Eirik stood at the river's edge in the pre-dawn darkness, watching the mist rise from the water. This was his thinking time, when he planned for the challenges ahead. Spring would bring its own difficulties, the alliance would end, decisions would need to be made about raiding or trading, and supplies that had lasted through winter would need replenishing. "You're up early, even for you," Hakon's voice came from behind him. Eirik turned to find the Jarl approaching, his breath misting in the cold air. Over the winter months, the two had developed a mutual respect. Hakon had initially dismissed Eirik as merely a servant, but had come to understand his crucial role. "Spring planning requires spring rising," Eirik replied. "The thaw brings opportunities and dangers in equal measure." "Spoken like a warrior, though you claim not to be one," Hakon observed. "I've been thinking, Peacemaker. My band needs someone like you. Someone who understands survival beyond the sword." It was an offer, carefully made. Eirik considered it equally carefully. "I'm sworn to Jarl Ragnar." "I know. I wouldn't ask you to break an oath. But if circumstances change." Hakon left the offer hanging in the morning air. They stood in comfortable silence, watching the sun paint the eastern sky in shades of pink and gold. Then Hakon asked, "What do you think will happen when the Frankish army withdraws?" "Chaos, initially," Eirik answered honestly. "Every band along the river will want to establish dominance for the trading season. Some will raid, others will fortify. The wise will form alliances that last beyond winter necessity. You think our alliance should continue? I think strength comes from unity, and prosperity from peace. But I'm just a household manager. Such decisions are for jarls and warriors." Hakon smiled slightly. "You say that, yet your words carry more weight than many swords. Ragnar is fortunate to have you." As the settlement woke, Eirik returned to his duties. The morning porridge needed making, but supplies were running low. He made it thinner than usual, adding dried berries and the last precious bits of honey to mask the dilution. They would need fresh supplies soon, or face the dangerous gap between winter stores running out and spring foods becoming available. Guillaume arrived at midday with a small cart of goods, salt, grain, and surprisingly, several chickens in wooden cages. Live chickens meant eggs, a renewable source of food if they could keep them alive and protected. The Frankish commander sends these as a gesture of good faith, Guillaume explained. The winter truce has held, trade has flowed. He hopes for continued peace. For a price, no doubt, Ragnar said, having come to oversee the trade. Everything has a price, Guillaume agreed. But the price of peace is often cheaper than the price of war. As Eirik supervised the unloading of supplies, he noticed one of the Frankish soldiers who had accompanied Guillaume watching him intently. The man was older, with the bearing of a veteran, but his interest seemed more curious than hostile. Finally, the soldier approached. "You're the one they call Peace-Maker?" Eirik nodded cautiously. The soldier continued in accented but understandable Norse. "I fought Vikings for 20 years. Hated you all. Then this winter, I watched your settlement. Watched you take in strangers, heal them, share your food. You're not what I expected. People rarely are, when you see them as people rather than enemies," Eirik replied. The soldier considered this, then said, "My name is Marcus. I manage supplies for the Frankish camp. Perhaps we could trade knowledge as well as goods. Your preservation methods, our farming techniques. Mutual benefit." It was a remarkable offer, one that would have been unthinkable months ago. Eirik looked to Ragnar, who nodded slightly. "I would welcome such exchange," Eirik said formally. Knowledge shared is knowledge doubled. The exchange of knowledge with Marcus proved more valuable than any trade of goods. The Frankish soldier showed Eirik how his people used certain salts to preserve meat in ways that kept it moister and more flavorful. In return, Eirik demonstrated the Viking method of preserving fish with precise amounts of salt and controlled drying that could keep it edible for months at sea. "Your people will be sailing soon," Marcus observed as they worked together in the settlement's smoking house. "When the ice fully clears." "Some will," Eirik agreed. "Others will stay, farm the land they've claimed. Vikings aren't just raiders, whatever stories you've heard." "I'm beginning to understand that," Marcus admitted. "This winter has taught me much about my enemies. Or rather, about how enemies can become something else when survival is at stake." Their exchange was interrupted by commotion from the longhouse. Gudrun had collapsed while treating a patient. Eirik ran to the healing space, finding the old woman conscious but weak, her face pale and drawn. "Just tired," she insisted, trying to rise from where young Astrid had helped her to a bench. An old woman who forgot to eat while feeding others. But Eirik could see it was more than that. The winter had been hard on everyone, but especially on those who gave constantly of themselves. Gudrun had barely slept for weeks during the worst of the sickness, and the strain showed. "You need rest," he said firmly. "Real rest, not the few moments you steal between patients." "And who will tend the sick?" she demanded. "Astrid has learned well. I know enough for basic treatments." And, he paused, thinking quickly, "Marcus tells me there's a Frankish healer who might be willing to trade service for knowledge. You could teach each other while you recover." Gudrun grumbled but didn't refuse outright, which from her was agreement. Eirik set about organizing care for the healer who had cared for so many others. It was a reminder that even the strongest among them had limits, that survival was a community effort where everyone must both give and receive support. That evening, as a gentle rain began to fall, liquid rain, not snow, another sign of spring's approach, Eirik found himself in council with both Jarls and their senior warriors. The topic was the future, always the future. "The ice will clear within a week," Hakon was saying. "My men grow restless. They came for raiding in England, not farming in Francia." "Yet some of your men have made marriages here," Ragnar pointed out. "Will you split your band?" "If necessary. Those who wish to stay, may stay. But I lead warriors, not farmers." Eirik listened to the discussion, understanding the tensions at play. Warriors define themselves by their battles, their raids, their glory. But he had seen something else this winter, warriors learning to preserve food, to tend the sick, to build and maintain rather than just destroy. The seeds of change had been planted, even if they didn't yet recognize it. "If I may speak," Eirik interjected carefully. The Jarls nodded. "Consider that England has been raided for generations. The pickings grow slimmer, the defenders better prepared. But here, along the Seine, there's opportunity for something different. Trade routes, permanent settlements, the chance to build rather than just take." "You would have us become merchants," one of Hakon's warriors scoffed. "I would have you become wealthy," Eirik replied calmly. "A successful merchant can afford better weapons, better ships, better lives for his children than a raider who might die on any beach." "And," he added, seeing he had their attention, "who says you can't do both? Trade in summer, raid in autumn, return to secure winter quarters. The Rus do this in the east, why not here in the west?" The idea was novel enough to spark real discussion. Eirik withdrew, his part said. He had planted seeds of his own, ideas that might grow into something unexpected. Later that night, unable to sleep, he walked through the settlement one more time. The place had transformed over the winter from a temporary camp to something approaching a permanent settlement. Gardens had been planned for spring planting. The smoking house had been expanded. A proper well had been dug. At the chicken coop, a small structure hastily built to house Guillaume's gifts, he found Sigrid, the blacksmith's daughter, carefully placing straw for nesting. "Shouldn't you be asleep, little one?" he asked gently. "I wanted to make sure they were comfortable," she said seriously. "Astrid says if we take care of them, they'll give us eggs every day. That's like magic, isn't it?" Food that just appears? Not magic, Eirik said, kneeling beside her. Just nature, properly managed. Everything we do, the farming, the preservation, the trading, it's all about working with nature rather than against it. Is that why they call you Peacemaker? Because you work with things instead of fighting them? From the mouths of children, Eirik thought, came the deepest wisdom. Perhaps it is, little one. Perhaps it is. The ice had cleared from the Seine, and with it came the inevitable changes. The Frankish army had begun withdrawing to Paris, their winter watch ended. Some of Hakon's band had already left, eager to continue their original journey. But others had chosen to stay, swearing new oaths to Ragnar or deciding to settle as farmers under his protection. To mark these transitions, Eirik had organized one last great feast. It would strain their remaining supplies, but the symbolism was important, a celebration of survival, of alliance, of the future being born from winter's hardships. The preparation took 3 days. Every skill Eirik had learned, every relationship he had built, came into play. Guillaume provided wine and wheat flour at favorable prices, remembering the fair treatment he had received. Marcus contributed Frankish delicacies, including preserved fruits and a wheel of aged cheese. Even the Frankish commander sent a gift, a young pig, perfect for roasting. The settlement buzzed with activity. The women prepared their finest clothes, warriors cleaned their weapons and armor to gleaming brightness, children practiced songs they would perform. This wasn't just a feast, it was a statement that they had not merely survived but thrived. Eirik worked tirelessly, coordinating every aspect. The main longhouse was cleaned and decorated with early spring flowers. The fire pit outside was prepared for roasting the pig. Tables were arranged to allow the mingling of different groups, Ragnar's original band, Hakon's remaining warriors, the Frankish guests who had been invited, and the traders who had become friends. On the morning of the feast, Gudrun, recovered from her exhaustion, pulled Eirik aside. "I have something for you," she said, producing a small leather pouch. Inside was a silver arm ring, inscribed with runes. "I can't accept this," Eirik protested. "It's too valuable." "It was my husband's," Gudrun said firmly. "He was a warrior, died in battle 30 winters ago. But he would have respected what you've done here. You've waged war against death itself and won more often than you've lost. Take it." Eirik accepted the gift solemnly, understanding its significance. In Viking culture, arm rings were symbols of oath and honor, usually given by jarls to warriors. For Gudrun to give him her husband's ring was recognition of a different kind of valor. As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples, the feast began. The pig, perfectly roasted and glistening with rendered fat, was carved and distributed. Fresh bread, still warm from the ovens, was broken and shared. The last of the winter vegetables, roasted with herbs, accompanied the meat. But it was more than food being shared. Stories were told in multiple languages, translated and retold until everyone understood. Thorkel the Skald performed a new saga, one that wove together Viking and Frankish heroes, suggesting a future where old enemies might become new allies. Children from both cultures played together, their laughter a universal language. Jarl Ragnar stood to speak, his voice carrying across the gathered crowd. "This winter, we learned that survival requires more than strength of arm. It requires wisdom, cooperation, and the courage to see enemies as potential allies. We have Peacemaker to thank for much of this wisdom." He gestured for Eirik to stand. Uncomfortable with the attention but understanding its necessity, Eirik rose. "You have served with honor and wisdom," Ragnar continued. "You have fed us, healed us, and shown us paths we didn't know existed. Therefore, I release you from your oath of service." There were gasps from the crowd. To be released from an oath could be punishment or reward, depending on context. Ragnar continued, "You are free to choose your path. Stay with us as a free man, go with Hakon if you wish, or chart your own course. Whatever you choose, you go with my respect and friendship." It was an extraordinary gift, freedom, but more than that, freedom with honor. Eirik bowed deeply, too moved to speak immediately. When he found his voice, he said simply, "I thank you, Jarl Ragnar. I will give my decision at dawn." The feast continued late into the night. Eirik moved through the crowd, ensuring everyone was fed, old habits dying hard. He spoke with many, warriors who had once scorned him now seeking his advice, Frankish soldiers curious about Viking ways, children who had come to see him as a grandfather figure. Near midnight, he found himself sitting with Marcus and Guillaume by the dying fire. The three unlikely friends, a Viking household manager, a Frankish supply master, and a merchant, share a final cup of mead. "What will you choose?" Guillaume asked. Eirik looked up at the stars, brilliant in the clear spring night. I think I will stay, but not as I was. There's land here that could be farmed. Trade routes that could be established. I'm too old to start raiding, but perhaps not too old to start building." "Building what?" Marcus asked. "A place where knowledge is shared freely. Where Vikings and Franks can trade without fear. Where survival isn't a constant battle but a shared effort." He smiled slightly. "Call it an old man's dream. Dreams have built greater things than swords ever conquered," Guillaume said, raising his cup. "To dreams, then." "To dreams," they echoed, their cups meeting with a gentle clink that seemed to ring with possibility. 3 months had passed since the feast, since Eirik had chosen his path. The small farmstead he had established sat on a rise above the Seine, positioned perfectly between the Viking settlement and the Frankish territories. It had become, as he had hoped, a neutral ground where both sides could meet, trade, and share knowledge. The morning sun illuminated neat rows of vegetables, some Viking varieties, some Frankish, and even a few from seeds Guillaume had brought from distant lands. The experimental garden was Eirik's pride, each plant a small victory against hunger, each successful crop a weapon in humanity's eternal war against want. Astrid worked beside him, no longer a thrall but a free woman, his adopted daughter in all but blood. She had proven gifted not just at household management but at the delicate work of diplomacy, helping translate and mediate between the various groups who came to trade. "The cabbages are doing well," she observed, checking the tight heads forming on the stalks. "We'll have sauerkraut for next winter." "In the winter after that," Eirik agreed. "Each year we learn more, preserve better, waste less. It's slow work, but important." A rider approached from the Viking settlement, one of Ragnar's men with news. The Jarl was calling a thing, a gathering to discuss the summer's plans. There was talk of a grand expedition, but also of establishing permanent farms, of bringing families from Norway to settle. "Will you go?" Astrid asked, knowing Eirik was always welcome at such gatherings despite no longer being sworn to any jarl. "Perhaps. To offer advice if asked. But my raiding days are long past, if they ever truly existed." As the morning progressed, visitors arrived at the farmstead. First came Gudrun, older and frilier but still sharp, bringing a young woman she was training in the healing arts. They examined Eirik's medicinal herbs, discussing which had proven most effective over the winter. Then came Marcus with several Frankish farmers, interested in the Viking methods of preserving fish. The exchange of knowledge had become regular, almost routine, enemies learning from each other that they were just people trying to survive and thrive. By midday, the farmstead was busy with activity. Children from both cultures played in the yard while their parents traded goods and information. The small hall Eirik had built, nowhere near as grand as a jarl's longhouse but solid and welcoming, hosted a shared meal where Viking bread and Frankish wine sat side by side on the same table. Watching it all, Eirik felt a deep satisfaction. This wasn't the life he had imagined as a young warrior sailing from Norway's fjords. But it was, perhaps, a better one. He had found his battlefield and won his victories, not with sword and shield but with patience and wisdom, negotiation and knowledge. As the sun began its descent toward evening, painting the sky in gentle pastels, Eirik stood in his garden, hands dirty from honest work, surrounded by the fruits of a different kind of conquest. The sound of laughter, Viking and Frankish children playing together, drifted on the evening breeze. Sigrid, the blacksmith's daughter, now a young woman, approached with her own small child, a baby born of a marriage between a Viking warrior and a Frankish woman who had met at Eirik's farmstead. "Peacemaker," she said, using the title with deep respect, "will you tell my son the story of the winter when enemies became allies?" Eirik smiled, settling onto a bench as others gathered around. "It began," he said, his voice taking on the cadence of a storyteller, "with understanding that survival is not a solitary act but a communal one. That hunger and cold are enemies to all, regardless of the gods they pray to or the languages they speak." As he told the story, embellishing it as all good storytellers do, the sun set over the Seine, painting the river gold. The settlement below, Viking longhouses and Frankish-style buildings now standing side by side, settled into evening routines. Smoke rose from cooking fires, the sound of evening songs drifted on the air, and peace, hard-won and carefully maintained, held sway. In the growing darkness, the first stars appeared overhead, the same stars that had watched over desperate winters and hopeful springs since time began. And Eirik, the peacemaker, continued his story, weaving together threads of survival and cooperation, of knowledge shared and prejudices overcome, creating from the harsh realities of medieval life a saga of a different kind of heroism. The fire crackled softly as his voice carried into the night, telling of a time when Vikings were more than raiders, when survival required more than strength, and when a damaged warrior found his greatest victories not on the battlefield but in the daily struggle against humanity's oldest enemies, hunger, cold, disease, and discord. And as his listeners gradually dozed, lulled by his calm voice and the comfortable warmth of the fire, Eirik continued speaking softly, his words becoming a bridge between waking and sleeping, between the harsh realities of their world and dreams of a better tomorrow. The art of survival, he knew, was not just about making it through another day, but about building something worth surviving for. The stars wheeled overhead, the river flowed eternally toward the sea, and in a small farmstead above the Seine, the peacemaker's story continued, soft and steady as a heartbeat, carrying his listeners gently into peaceful sleep, where they might dream of a world where enemies could become allies, where knowledge was the greatest treasure, and where survival was not a battle but a shared journey toward dawn. And so, dear listener, as Eirik's story blends into the whisper of wind through growing grain, as the cooking fires bank to glowing embers, as the settlement sleeps under spring's gentle hand, let your own eyes grow heavy. Let the rhythm of medieval life, the patient work of survival, the quiet heroism of daily bread and preserved meat carry you into restful slumber. For tomorrow will bring its own challenges, its own needs for wisdom and cooperation, but tonight, rest. Dream of rivers flowing toward the sea, of seeds planted with hope, of winter survived and spring embraced. Sleep well, carried by the knowledge that survival's greatest victories are won not with swords but with patience, not with force but with wisdom, not alone but together. Sleep now, and dream of peace.